Good afternoon, all, and thanks for tuning in to the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. With less than a week to go before the beginning of the 2022 Qatar World Cup, we'll be talking today about how the media has shaped migrant rights issues ahead of and indeed beyond the World Cup. We will also be talking about what has been done, and perhaps more crucially, what remains to be done in terms of tracking these reforms and ensuring their durability beyond the World Cup. But before we get to that, and before introducing our wonderful speakers today, a little bit of context. In April 2010, it was announced that Qatar would be hosting the World Cup. While many celebrated the fact that this was the first time a Muslim majority country had hosted this particular mega sporting event, the bid was marred by allegations of corruption by FIFA. This soon gave way to discussions in the media about Qatar's poor treatment of migrant workers, the temperature, LGBTQ rights, and whether alcohol would be allowed. Indeed, many have argued that the World Cup and the attendant media coverage has shone a light on migrant rights issues, leading to substantial labor reforms. The need for such reporting and an international spotlight has been underscored by a lack of domestic media liberalization, which has created a reliance on outside reporting with a lack of boots on the ground. On the other hand, people have also felt that some of the coverage of Qatar has been beset by racism and Orientalism and sensationalist reporting that has relied on misleading statistics and anecdotal interviews that often overlook deeper structural problems. These criticisms have been compounded by a sense that Qatar's relevance is only related to its hosting of the World Cup. Indeed, by my own accounts, I think in the UK, 40% of all articles mentioning Qatar in the headline are actually about the World Cup, meaning that Qatar is largely mediated through its connection to football. And by way of comparison, only 3% of all headlines about the Russia World Cup mentioned, or about Russia mentioned the World Cup. Anyway, given this tension between the importance of press coverage in aiding accountability, but also the need for accurate and balanced reporting, how has the media shaped migrant rights ahead of the World Cup? And to discuss this today, I'm very lucky to be joined by Faisal Al-Mudahka, who's the editor-in-chief of Gulf Times. Also joining us today will be Vani Saraswathi, who is the director of projects and editor-at-large at migrantrights.org. And last but not least, Marc Tuñón, who's the head of the International Labour Organization office in Qatar. I myself am Marc Owen Jones. I'm an associate professor of Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Just a quick note before we begin is that this will be translated into Arabic. So if you listening or speaking Arabic, then please tune in onto that channel. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our first question to Faisal. How has Qatar responded to international media critiques and concerns about migrant rights?
Thank you for hosting me today, and thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon for everyone. Actually, you know, I want to really first break it into three elements, okay? So one, okay, so migrant workers, one. First, Qatar as a host city and contractor and contracting world, they are called client, okay? So normally, if you build anything, you are the client, you hire a client representative. So a client representative is the contractor. So this is one side, okay? So it's 8 stadium, 6 stadium built by a European famous construction company and a company from China and a company from Turkey. 6 of our metro lanes, 4 of them are built by a famous also French contractor, Vinci, and I don't know, but most of those are international companies. And most international companies in contracting has HSE. HSSE is health, safety, environment, measurement. And normally those companies are like very old, and even their benchmark or their standard is even away far from Qatar standard long time ago when the award came. So, let me give a very good an example. For example, Nike is a shoes maker. They do their shoes in in Vietnam, and they were accused, for example, of child laboring. Okay, the story went away. Wherever we don't see any countries really attacking US. You know, you see Nike share holders are under attack. You see Nike stock market price goes down. You know, so those are more into the client representative, the company itself. I mean, we are not far from yesterday Amazon firing 10,000 people. You see, the public is into Amazon, not into the US. Again, Elon Musk with Twitter fired 50% of people, and they're out of job. And one email, bye, no even end of benefit. So no, in our case, we have a mix. I mean, it's not the government who have built those stadiums. The government have hired people. Okay. Talking about, and so this is one thing. Another thing is policies. You want to ask me about policies 10 years ago and now? Of course, policies have changed because the whole environment, the whole landscape have changed. You know, we used to be like, you know, the only thing we build in Qatar those days are schools, universities, small infrastructure. But with all this mega project, you know, completing the airport, the metro, whatever, we have invited all this international contracting. And so it's a kind of really, it's a really a strange, you know, I come from also, you know, I have studied in Paris. I have a background of business, and I never saw a case study like this that shows very clearly that Qatar is, there's two people, there is two kind, if I can put this in perspective. One, there is a propaganda, very clear one. And again, there is people who are ignorant. And also there is maybe policies need to be fast forward, which maybe the World Cup have made it fast forward, and even something to be done, because we are not going to stop from our big ambitions of developing the country a long time ago. So I'm sure the government is going to reforms more things that is needed, you know. But remember, you know, Qatar is independent in 1971. So we are a very young country. We are an emerging country. So of course policies change. You know, today, if you think of the US, if you think of Europe, the minimum wage, has it stopped since the 70s? No, it's based on inflation, whatever. The minimum wage gets, the reforms get changed. So we are very pragmatic when it comes to policy, I think, the government. And I think the criticism was really not a fair say, because it's not, as I have explained, I don't know if I have explained it very well.
I think you explained a lot of some of the reforms that have taken place. I just wanted to clarify, do you think the reforms that have taken place, do you think media pressure has been useful in generating some of the reforms that you mentioned?
Look, I don't think the media pressure, I think the media pressure have created an anger because it's unrealistic. As I told you, the meme of the whole this, that World Cup, if policies was not there, we have acknowledged our problem 10 years ago. We have never done mega construction, but where are the companies? Where is Bioje? Where is Fancy? Where is Larson? Where is the, you know, all these companies? Why they are not under criticism? You know, they are the company who cashed out. The money is out of Qatar. They are the one who hired the laborers. So government normally have two things. One, policies that really related to the environment. And second, enforcement of law if companies have not, those are, I think, the two questions that has to be asked. One, does the law meet the mega project and standard, and the project is here, or it's backdated? This is one question. The second question, I think, if it is fair to ask, does the government enforce people who violate their policies? You know, but blaming the client for a mislead or something that has been done by the contractor, and if you see, by the way, Mashare built by a contractor from England, from Korea, from wherever. I don't see them in the news. You know, the only thing that I see is Qatar, 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 Qatar.
I see. So arguing that, like in this case, the media has tended to focus on Qatar and not, say, the commercial entities or the transnational companies that also benefit financially from this. Okay.
Yes.
I think that's been noted by some academics who've highlighted that there's a tendency to ignore the transnational aspect of this. But Faisal, as we're running out of time, I just wanted to ask you as an editor, do you think that the local media has an important role to play in documenting or tracking the implementation, say, of migrant worker reforms?
Look, the local media have covered all the reforms. You know, we are like more like a mirror of what is happening in Qatar. Okay, we have, you know, I remember an incident that some worker have got injured in a workforce, and the contractor have hide that incident, and it's an international, very famous, a $50 billion revenue company contractor, and what happened that when the government found out and the labor, they fired 20 people. One of them is the HEC director of that company, and we have reported that. But as I tell you, you know, you work more, you have to have more measurements. You work more, you have to have more policies. What I think that the World Cup, not the media have pressure to change the policy. I think it's only fast forward. And I think even after the World Cup, we will even, the government will even reform as needed, you know? So really, I don't know if I answer your question, but I think the media have played a big part on that. If you see local media, even Bana Arab, like Al Jazeera English, the reports were there, you know? And so this is what I can say on this subject, to tell you the truth.
Thank you so much, Faisal. I appreciate that. Okay, so moving on to Vani, I'll ask the same question. How has Qatar responded to international media critiques and concerns about migrant rights?
Yeah, I just want to touch upon what Faisal said, but a little later, just talking about media coverage alone. At this point of time, in the last 5 months, when we talk about media coverage, we're talking about Western media. But right at the beginning, right, in 2010, December when they won, and even before that, the media that was covering these issues were regional media from origin countries, which have, you know, I don't want to name journalists, but journalists from Nepal, from India, writing for regional language newspapers based in Doha, were constantly covering the plight of the citizens in order to get their governments to act upon it. And that often seems to be overlooked. And in the initial days, I was living in Qatar for a bulk of that time, from 1999. I worked for several local media publications, including Gulf Times. And I must say that over the years, the local media coverage of these issues has dwindled almost to nothing. Except for rejoinders from government for international media reporting. We're not seeing any original reporting. There was always a level of, I would say, self-censorship, because most of the local journalists are migrants themselves. They're mainly from Asia or some Arab countries. And they had a lot to lose by taking on the powers to be. But even then, you did have a level of coverage when things were going, you know, bad locally. And we've seen, in response to international focus, media focus on Qatar, the local media going silent. You know, they have really scaled back on even the little bit of reporting they used to do. The reason we need to look at it is this is not the first huge issues that when it was hosting the WTO in 2000, the biggest issue then was child jockeys. And you saw a different response to it. You saw the government, the Human Rights Committee, actually being proactive. And even though there was no local media reporting, there wasn't much of international reporting either, but they did ban child jockeys. We're not seeing that so much because the response to international media coverage has been rather defensive. Yes, I agree. Some of it has been probably inaccurate, to say the least, absolutely inaccurate, starting from 2014 when Washington Post spoke about 4,500 deaths in World Cup stadiums, without really any basis. To now, we do see some inaccuracy, but we also see that if international media and if regional media from origin countries were not covering it, then what would this environment look like? Would there have been any pressure at all? The primary leverage was, of course, the trade union movement, which tried to hold Qatar accountable and then is now working with them. So definitely credit goes to them, but equally to the media that covered it, which over the years has, become pretty muddied. I've said it before. We are not able to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff at this point, because there is a level of original reporting and then people are reporting on the reports and it gets exaggerated. So this continues to be an issue. The other problem that we have, when there was independent media that was shut down, and we saw the benefits, for instance, when, again, going back to bad statistics and data, local media was able to call out with the reporting they did on the ground without being seen as doing PR for the government. And I really feel that Qatar failed to see the benefit and the advantage in cultivating a free press. Yes, Al Jazeera is covered, but I can literally count the number of migrant rights issues Al Jazeera has covered in the last 7-8 years, maximum 8 or 9, a couple of which was during COVID. So what is the point in having a really well-respected international media headquartered, but yet not looking at what's happening around, when they step out in Madinat Khalifa from the office, they can see it, right? So you do have misreporting, you do have misrepresentation of statistics and data in international media, but I wouldn't say that that is the biggest problem. The biggest problem is lack of context while covering it, where the reporting ends up victimizing every single low-income migrant worker, taking away from their humanity. They come here with a plan, they come here with a migration goal, they want their children to have better education, but to kind of, I think both sides, they've ignored that. Either looking at it as, a charity for poorer countries by hosting their workers. Now, coming back, I know I'm running out of time probably, but
You're doing okay, actually. You have 5 minutes.
So I just want to talk about what Faisal mentioned. Definitely businesses need to be held accountable. And I think some of the media is doing it. So the media works in a certain way, right? When you're writing about a particular case of workers not being paid or being treated badly, you do write about the company, you do mention the company, and then there are other NGOs like the Human Rights Resource Center that would follow up with the business and ask them what actions are being taken. We as an organization do that with all our reports. We always reach out to the businesses, try to find out what they have to say. This does exist, but accountability of businesses is not for media alone. We see in the last 1 year, companies that have a record of exploitation have been given government contracts. I was at a conference recently in Doha. The security company that has the recent contract was a security company that at the beginning of the reforms in 2020, September, messed around with contracts. So you're actually rewarding poor practices and not incentivizing good practices. You did mention Vinci. There is a court case against Vinci in France for their work in Qatar. And that was based on media reporting. So we can't just say that the media doesn't report. It does report. What is really lacking is reporting by media within Qatar. We have Northwestern University. They've been there for over 10 years, a journalism program, a world-class journalism program. Why don't we see, there are some excellent journalist graduates who've come out. Why aren't we cultivating them? Why aren't they more empowered or being protected when they report on issues locally? I think this is really a time to look at how local media has failed to be a watchdog and then to have more nuanced reporting, in which case then you can counter international reporting on this issue.
Thanks, Vani. I think the notion that local media are not playing the role that they could be is a really interesting one. And you mentioned earlier that maybe 5 or beyond 5 years ago, it was perhaps a bit better. Do you have any sense why it changed?
So I think one of it was when I first moved to Qatar, the population was 700. And it was almost like someone in the media team knew someone in the community and it was easier to report. But very quickly, even the business environment changed, right? From big companies employing all the boots on the ground to only employing about 30 to 40% and subcontracting the rest to manpower supply companies and subcontracting companies. And it created, yes, there are international businesses like Bechtel, like Vinci, who are all working there. But equally, local businesses, Qatari-owned businesses, have profited as well. And they are the ones who own the subcontracting business and the manpower supply business. And they are very powerful. Some of them on the boards of the newspapers, local newspapers. So, and the problems, exploitation happens very much in the subcontracting chain, more than in direct hires. But then if you're going to write about them, you're actually writing probably about one of the board, board members or someone very, very influential locally. And that has probably, scared people away, I must say, because some very interesting reporting did happen on discrimination of migrant workers' access to public spaces and all of it. It was done by the local media, by journalists. When I say local journalists, I mean, they may be non-citizens, but living and working in Qatar. And you're not seeing that kind of discourse. It's the same set of journalists who have done excellent work, or maybe they just fear losing their job. It could be self-censorship as much as, a government.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think that's an interesting takeaway that we'll probably move away from the seminar with, is something about the role of local media. But I want to hear now from Max, again with the same question. Feel free to interpret it as you will. How has Qatar responded to international media critiques and concerns about migrant rights?
Thanks, Marc, and thanks to the Middle East Council for organizing this important discussion. Firstly, perhaps I don't need to mention it, but I'm not an expert in this field in terms of media analysis or from the industry. I'm just sharing a few perspectives based on a lot of interviews that we've carried out from the ILO side in recent months, and how that's been portrayed in the media, or how the overall reforms and the tournament has been covered in the media in recent months in particular. As Faisal and Vani have already said, it's really important not to generalize. We've got a media that is local, that is regional, that comes from countries of origin, that is international, and also within that we see journalists who have the sports desk or regional correspondents, political correspondents, etc. All of them with different takes, different contexts, different backgrounds, and with different angles to this. So it's really hard to make generalized statements, but I think one thing we can say is that when we talk to regional correspondents, people based in the region or in Qatar, they perceive things very differently. People, once they come to Qatar and visit Qatar, they also perceive things differently from what they had anticipated, or what they had anticipated largely due to media coverage, I would suppose, that they'd read back home. And especially when we think about change over time, people that have been coming to Qatar or to the region for several years will be able to pick up the changes that have occurred in that period. They'll be able to recognize what it means, when we talk about introducing some of these specific reforms, whether it's exit permits or minimum wages, etc. When it comes to the government's reaction, I think it's no secret they've been quite vocal in recent weeks about the disappointment that a lot of the media coverage doesn't really reflect the progress that has been made in the past 5 years or so, positive developments. And in some cases, when it is reflected, it often comes at the end of an article, once the tone has already been very much set, often with a sensationalized headline. Even when there is a balanced article, often, and I don't know how it works, the experts can tell me, but often it can be the sub-editor or somebody else who will put a more sensational headline to attract more attention to it. And I think there's also a feeling from some that, you know, every aspect of the tournament, or even every aspect of the country, is grounds for criticism, and the default position is critical. You know, that, and one thing that I think we all have to recognize is that Qatar has, of course, by hosting the event, put itself in the spotlight. But also they have granted, I think, a kind of unprecedented level of access, shared an unprecedented amount of information compared to what they were doing before, for sure, and compared to what several other countries would have and would provide in terms of information and access. And I know that many of the reports that Vani publishes and that other international organizations and NGOs publish are reporting on issues that happen all across the region, whether it's domestic workers' rights or wage protection or, you know, kafala, etc., safety and health. But Qatar is usually singled out just because of the hosting of the World Cup, even though there are countries with much larger workforces, more workers in difficult situations. It's not to say that Qatar shouldn't be under the spotlight. I'm just saying that this is, you know, sometimes there's a perception that there is a double standard. Fundamentally, I think there's a need for more nuance, more context, as Vani said. It's not all bad, as is reflected in parts of the international media. It's not all good, as is reflected in parts of the local media. There is legitimate criticism in some of the reporting, and there's also sensationalized and poor reporting on top of that. One of the things also that, you know, I'm hypothesizing is that people who do aim to provide more nuance and context are increasingly viewed with suspicion or have their legitimacy attacked. And I think this kind of feeds into a cycle where people are more afraid to speak out and even offer their perspective, because they know that, especially in this environment, they're going to be singled out, and they have to be extremely careful with their words because they know it's going to be amplified. You know, so it's a bit of a minefield, even for people who want to lend a little bit more context to this debate. I think finally, does it have an impact on policy? Was one of the questions you were asking earlier. As Vani said, you know, these reforms started 5 years ago, following a campaign. They've been shaped by issues that have emerged through reporting, through the experiences of workers that we talk to on a daily basis, through issues that have been raised by community leaders and community liaison officers from the international unions, raised, you know, from reports from different organizations. What we can say is that I think it has had an impact on policy in certain European countries. You know, I was in the European Parliament yesterday in the Committee on Human Rights, and it was very evident that policymakers and certain parliamentarians have very strong positions on Qatar based on what they've read in the media. So it wasn't surprising to hear, you know, reference to the 6,500 figure. It wasn't surprising to hear the assumption that 2 million migrant workers in the country are victims of forced labor. And it wasn't surprising to hear that everybody associated everything in Qatar to the World Cup, just to one tournament. So in that sense, you know, it has had concrete impacts on policy and the positions of policymakers in Europe. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you so much, Max, for that comprehensive view. I mean, towards the end, you mentioned specifically the impact that this coverage has had on policymakers in Europe. And you mentioned the 6,500 figure, which I suppose for the benefit of people who don't know, although I imagine most people do know, this figure was a Guardian headline, and it referred to a number of deaths from among Bangladeshis, Nepalese, Indians, and Sri Lankans living in Qatar over a 10-year period. In your sense, has that figure become an accepted truth?
For some, you know, I was just talking to a journalist today that didn't have the full context around that figure. And, you know, it's been pointed out that even if you go back to the original article from The Guardian, it provides some of that context, but it's repeated and repeated again without each time losing some of the context, and becomes, in certain quarters, an accepted truth. I think there's been a lot more analysis, yourself and others have pointed out why this is misleading. From the ILO side, we've pointed out why it's misleading. We've also presented, how the government is currently collecting data on occupational injuries and deaths and how it needs to be improved, and presented data that we've collected in the course of 2020. But it's for sure a figure that is stuck in people's minds, and that people definitely attribute to the construction of World Cup stadiums, which is extremely problematic.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I just on that note, I think it's quite interesting to reflect on the notion that this is probably a first for at least any World Cup in terms of reportage. I don't think those numbers in terms of total death statistics have been counted in any other World Cup in terms of a labor force. So I think it's it's an interesting case where this number has been, or this type of counting for the deaths of, in this case, migrant workers, but also in other contexts, it would be the labor force. This is a first for that. I think, Vani, you would like to just add one thing before we move on to our second section? I think, Vani, have you frozen?
Yeah, just first to acknowledge that, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I think just to acknowledge that media did have access to Qatar, right? And we work in the Gulf, we report from all of the Gulf states, and we know the level of issues we have in entering those countries and reporting. I just want to acknowledge that even with journalists that Qatar has not agreed with, they have been allowed to re-enter and report, which is the way it should be. It's not like, it's not a favor. In terms of the 6,500 number, the problem is in how it's been interpreted. That is definitely an issue. Equally, the problem is the lack of disaggregated data. Qatar does have, if I just took the moment to say, this
Sorry, you're breaking up a little, Vani.
Breakdown. We have so many Sri Lankan. No point have they ever made Qatari versus non-Qatari number without really breaking down, disaggregating the data, which means you're not able to really counter it effectively. And next, not really investigating deaths in order to say, okay, these are the deaths that we really need to investigate, and there is a problem with it. So I think holding back data is also an issue that kind of fed that monster of that rather inaccurate number. Yeah.
Thank you, Vani. It cut off a little during that, but I think we got the gist. If I'll just paraphrase it, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, is that you noted that part of the problem that led to, or partly led to figures like 6,500 was the lack of disaggregated data about deaths and demographics within Qatar. And the lack of these figures means that it feeds into this tendency to report things inaccurately. If those figures were available, for example, to local media or even international media, it would allow for better reporting. So, okay, thank you. And just before we move on to our second section, Faisal, I think you want to chip in, which would be a nice way to round off this section.
Yeah. Just to comment on the local media and local media, what Vani have said and generalize her statement. Look, I have worked in media for many years. I have dealt with international media. I have never seen a hate speech in Europe and the complex of savior that is there now. We have cartoons with bombs, our players with hate speech, with bombs, in France. We have official from the UK calling us, we are not intellectually ready. It's really a comment that really not even savage has been used in Europe. So the bottom line, Vani or the audience, is have we changed the policies to co-op with what is happening? Yes, we have changed the policies. Did the government change the policies? Yes. the Nepalis, the Bangladesh, the laborers, are they representative? Were their community leaders? Were their ambassadors? Yes, yes, they are representative. Back to holding statistic. Look, Qatar, to be fair, it is everywhere, and CIA fact and everywhere. You know that the demographic of Qatar, that expats are almost 90 to 85%. Everybody lives in Qatar knows that. You know, we are a minority here, right? In terms of a community. So that's 500, again, 6,500 number. We cannot hide statistic, it's already there. We have representative an agreement with international bodies and the Ministry of Health. This is very clear. We have representative from communities, as I said, we have embassies are here. 6,500 is from the 90% of expat, everybody who's living in Qatar. So I have done my research. It represents 0.3 rate death, which in England and any in the West is the normal rate is 9%. So I really disagree with the holding statistic, because it's just Google it. You will see the number of the demographic of Qatar is very clear. And secondly, you cannot, every death is a tragedy, and you cannot hide death, to tell you the truth, you know, because you have embassies. We have more than 112 embassies in Qatar, the most in the Middle East. International bodies are here, offices. So this is really a misinformation that has been going, and it's really annoying, not only Qataris, annoying the Arab, because you know, it's this media, you know, the whole idea of the World Cup is to change the stereotype of what has been told us. Other than the 605,000, 200 billion, it is the most. Okay, that's the stereotype. The sheikh, the Rolls Royce, the oil, the camel. We are putting cash throwing in the water. No, we are smart. 2/3 of our population are youth. We have studied outside. In the West, the same. So we are not, this disinformation can be passed long time in the 60s and the 70s when you have headlines, it's finished. No,
Faisal,
today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry, we just need to wrap up this first section. But
okay.
Thanks. Sure,
thank because I want, you know, but sure. Misleading, this is very important for me.
No, I completely agree. I don't think, my sense is that no one's disagreeing, actually. Everyone's acknowledged that the figure is misleading. I think the point here is that
the holding of statistic, I don't think there is a hold of statistic. That's what I'm saying.
I think there could be more transparency. No one's saying there isn't any transparency. I think Max already mentioned, for example, they've been given a substantial amount of access. I will say, I think there could be a little more transparency about statistics, but I don't think it's an excuse for any media organization, wherever they are, to use statistics like that, 6,500, and justify it because they say there's no transparency. I don't think that's acceptable in any sense, and that's problematic. So I think those two arguments need not to be the same thing. More transparency can be good, but lack of transparency doesn't necessarily need to be, it can't be used by media organizations to justify it. I think that's important. And just as a final point, I think, yes, some of the media, or a lot of the media, has been framed through an Orientalist lens. Countless studies have shown that the depiction of the global South or the world outside Europe is generally more negative and full of stereotypes. So I think that's some context that maybe was missing from the beginning of this, and it's important to acknowledge. But now I think we need to move on to our second part, which is actually about the substance of the reforms. And so we're going to start with Max, because it's timely in a way, because I know the ILO just released a report this month about the past year and about labor reforms. So I'm going to ask you, Max, is what issues remain in terms of tracking outcomes and implementation of these reforms, and how durable are these reforms as Qatar reevaluates its post-World Cup priorities?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. So just before getting into that, I would say that, you know, our analysis of where we are in terms of the adoption and implementation of reforms comes from daily interaction with workers in our office, we're receiving complaints from workers. We also work with a network of trade union staff on the ground here in Qatar who are community liaison officers reaching out to workers on a daily basis as well. We also base our analysis on data, administrative data from the government, but also survey data that we've conducted with Qatar's universities, Social Economic Survey Research Institute, and also with our engagement with employers. And also importantly, looking at how the government responds to the issues that have been raised, to the gaps that have been raised, not just on an individual case basis, but what are the systematic issues underlying those cases, and how is the government responding and addressing and filling those gaps. And for sure, we can say that we've seen tangible, real progress that have improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers in the past 4.5 years. We've seen major developments in terms of new laws and policies, and the systems that have been introduced or enhanced to support their effective implementation and enforcement. And we've seen, as I was mentioning before, this kind of much greater engagement with the international community, with ILO, NGOs, trade unions, critics, media, etc. Where we still see the need for more work. Firstly, our top priority is to see the full implementation of the kafala reforms. Now, in 2 years, 350,000 workers have changed jobs, which is significant. But not all workers and employers are benefiting from these reforms. There are still gaps in terms of understanding about the processes for changing jobs. And when some workers, when they try to change jobs, they may face retaliation in some instances, retaliation that can take the form of canceling their QIDs, their residency permits, absconding charges being filed against them, threats of deportation. We still see that too frequently, but we're working with the government to address that, to prevent absconding charges being filed in an abusive way, and also to help workers recover their legal status in a simplified, more streamlined manner. The second priority relates to wage protection. And again, here it's a mixed story. On the one hand, much greater access to complaints mechanisms. When the online complaints mechanism was introduced, the number of complaints more than doubled. In the last 12 months, we've seen 34,000 workers lodge complaints, including through anonymous channels. So that's a positive. There are now 5 labor dispute settlement committees or labor courts. This increase of 2 additional labor courts will mean that cases can be seen in a more timely manner. And the government has established a workers' support and insurance fund to pay out workers once they get a decision from those labor courts. That fund has paid out $320 million in just a few years, and that the amount has also spiked in recent months. It's positive, the government stepping in to help ensure that workers receive their due wages, but it also points to the scale of the problem of wage abuses and wage protection. So these systems are new. They're really just 1, 2, 3 years old. And our priority now is not so much access. Of course, there are some workers, especially domestic workers, who will have restricted access to these complaints mechanisms. But for us, the priority is now, how can we streamline the processes? That workers don't have to wait several months in order to recover their due wages. And again, this is something that we're working with the government on. It's not that they're unaware of this, we're working on it. The third priority relates to the rights of domestic workers. New legislation was adopted in 2017 for the first time recognizing domestic workers as workers, providing them with protections. Last year, we saw a model employment contract, a standard employment contract introduced for domestic workers, which brought over more protections from the labor law to cover this particular vulnerable sector of work. But we still see gaps in implementation, especially when we look at working time, and especially when we think about the domestic workers' right to at least 1 day off per week. And we've seen, challenges in implementing this law in particular. There are other gaps, there are other challenges, but just wanted to highlight 3. And in that, to a broader point, I think there needs to be perhaps a little bit more understanding that it's not surprising that there are gaps. These are significant changes that have been adopted. the reforms to the kafala are, a game changer. The introduction of a minimum wage, many people complain that it's too low, but we see quite a high degree of compliance here, and wage protection issues are priority, but these are the result of deeper structural issues that also require attention. And changing mindsets, changing business practices, building these institutions is going to take time. I really want to challenge the idea that these reforms are not having an impact on workers' lives. Many people will say that, okay, they're good laws on paper, but they're not having an impact. We've commissioned this study, as I mentioned, with Sesri from Qatar University, with over 1,000 workers. 86% of respondents, low-wage workers, felt that the reforms had had a positive impact on their lives. The ILO works on these complicated issues of forced labor and child labor and freedom of association and safety and health all over the world. And it's never easy, and it's never a quick fix. But I think it's also important to recognize, how much Qatar has done in a relatively short period of time. And also to recognize that we're not at the finishing line. And I don't think anybody suggests that that's the case. We, the ILO, will continue to work with the government of Qatar, with workers and employers in Qatar, to ensure that all workers can benefit from these reforms well beyond the World Cup.
Thank you very much, Max. That was great. And just quickly, do you think that these reforms are durable? Do you think after the World Cup that the government is committed to following through?
Yeah, I think, the government has said many times that these reforms are not just about the World Cup, that it has, as Faisal mentioned, accelerated changes, but these changes are very much in line with their national vision. And they're not the only country in the region with these national visions and these national strategies to develop more competitive economies and more diversified and skills-based economies. There's more and more recognition that when we look at the kafala reforms, for example, this is not just good for workers, this is good for employers. They are able to hire workers locally instead of hiring internationally, which brings in costs and risk for them.
Yeah.
When we think about, rather than workers coming for just a short period of time, for 4 or 5 years at a time, and then going back home or migrating to another country, when that happens, the country loses skilled and experienced workers. By allowing labor mobility, you keep those workers in the country, in the economy, which benefits the workers, but also benefits the employers. They can benefit from a more skilled, productive workforce. So in that sense, you build up this competitive economy. So for those reasons, it's not just about international pressure, it's also about the national strategy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Max. Moving on to Vani, what issues do you think remain in terms of tracking outcomes and implementation of these reforms, and how durable are they post-World Cup?
Yeah. I hope a line doesn't cut off now. I think I don't want to see as the World Cup as the end game of all of these reforms. Clearly, there are ambitions and there are construction projects, and that goes well beyond December 2022. So this is just probably, at this point of time, the biggest ambition Qatar has had. So keeping that in mind, we need to just monitor how the reforms are going to be implemented. What is really important, I think what's happened in the last 5-6 years with a flurry of new legislations and reforms and ministerial decisions, it has to a large extent been in response to criticism alongside meeting the ILO standards, which Qatar is a party to, the convention. So it's been responding to the criticism, trying to meet those standards. And there is a very significant part of that journey that has been ignored, which is actually local buy-in, working with the community, working with the business community locally, working with its long-term residents, citizens. You can't just have laws exist in a vacuum, right? People are engaging with it. People need to believe in it. People need to see the benefit of it. And that hasn't happened, unfortunately, because everything has hurried. So maybe there is an opportunity to do that going forward. But that opportunity will come only when there is, when the country is open enough to allow local civil society engagement, local media reporting. It's really, really, because the international media is going to move on. They might still cover for the next few months. The international NGOs might also cover, but keep in mind, there's a lot of it is about money, right? What is going to bring in money to do that kind of coverage? That will pass on. And then there's a real opportunity to say, okay, we've done these reforms, we've come this far, and we've regressed a little bit. How do we correct it? And one key example is the job change without employers' permission, which when it was launched end of August, early September 2020, at the height of the pandemic, was very smooth for the first few months. And I've spoken to Max about it as well. But the timing of the whole situation in the pandemic, when you couldn't have new recruitment and with businesses suddenly fearing loss of control, there was a pushback. There was a pushback at so many levels, the business community, the Shura Council, and there has been a regression, the requirement for a de facto NOC with a resignation letter. So we've seen these things play out. Now is the time, I feel, to just say, okay, these are the issues that businesses face, these are the issues workers face, but this can happen only when there's a dialogue, and that dialogue has to happen at the grassroots level, not by gatekeepers from the global north. There cannot be, even now, yes, there are community liaison officers, highly respected professionals doing fantastic work, but they're literally a handful dealing with 1.5 million low-income workers. You need, for them to really do their work effectively, you need more voices from the ground without fear of retribution, detention, deportation, losing their livelihood. That is the fear that workers live in. That is the fear a lot of people, residents live in, even the ones with extreme privilege working in international institutions have that fear. It's just multifold when you talk about low-income workers whose families are dependent on them. How do you create an environment? Because you can't have these regulations, you cannot have these reforms without allowing the stakeholder, the key rights holder, to understand and be able to negotiate that those rights are met. That isn't happening now, and that really needs to happen going forward. I don't have a very bleak outlook in the sense that everything is going to be terrible after the World Cup. I feel the pace of reforms might be slower, and there's going to be a correction in terms of the number of people itself, right? A lot of people have been recruited for the short term, even without their knowledge. They think they're coming on full-term contracts, but they've been recruited for short term. They're going to go back. There's going to be a lot of issues in the next few months in terms of access to justice for this group. It will take maybe 6 to 7 months for that to settle. And then we have to revisit and see. This is good for the economy because Qatar's dependency on lower-income migrant workers is not going away. It's going to stay and it's going to increase. We know that. Faisal mentioned about, the population breakdown. You have a dependency of over 90% of the labor market. They are there. The individual is temporary, as I keep saying, but that system is permanent. And you need to have policies that recognize their permanency, recognize the dependency on them, respect them for that. And then all of the ILO standards we talk in terms of decent work and fair wages, only then will it really make sense. Otherwise, it's just words on paper.
Thank you very much, Vani. And maybe this would be an opportunity to ask, I just want to ask, because I think you mentioned it towards the end, leading up to the World Cup in the next few months. Do you have any particular concerns in the lead up to kickoff, about overwork and overtime? And do you see any industries in particular at risk?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I somehow missed this, and I don't know how. Of course, domestic workers, which Max mentioned, they're always ignored and neglected by the system. So are the fishing and agriculture workers. They're not covered by the labor law. They don't have, there are a lot of exclusions when it comes to protections, and they are a sizable number. But just in the next 5 to 6 weeks, the hospitality sector, which is highly feminized, you have a lot of women working, but we do not have laws that look at gender-based violence. We don't have laws. We don't have systems in terms of filing complaints when it comes to harassment. the hospitality sector is overwhelmed, and there is a disconnect in the sense that the property, the brand owner disconnects themselves from what's happening on the ground, saying that recruitment, that property is owned by a local entity. We have no say. We can only think about operations. And that actually is not true. Yeah, because you're there, your name is there, and you choose which of your staff will be direct hires and protected, and the rest are invisible. So I think the hospitality sector, the women in that, and then just going forward in terms of the labor market itself, domestic work, yes, they're recognized as workers, but they're not yet recognized as a very, very integral part of the labor economy. It runs in Qatar because there are these services highly subsidized within households without their employers being held accountable. So we need to see how we can formalize that relationship as well.
Okay. Thank you, Vani. Before we go to Faisal, Max, you just have your hand up. Did you want to add something quickly to that point? You're muted, Max.
Sorry. Just to your question about specific concerns during the World Cup, for sure, we know that this is a kind of unprecedented event. This is unique in Qatar's history. We know that all around the World Cup brings additional pressure and intensification of work. And we've anticipated this, and with the Ministry of Labor, designed a targeted inspection campaign around 3 themes: around accommodation standards, because we know that there's going to be a spike in the number of workers coming into the country on a temporary basis. Where are they staying? Are they staying in decent accommodation? 2 is the issue of working hours. As I said, already some sectors of work are already working long, excessive hours. They're going to be put under even more pressure during the World Cup to satisfy also the interests of a huge visiting population. When we think about retail or restaurants, in addition to hospitality and security. And thirdly is the issue of occupational safety and health around temporary installations. If you bring in a large population, constructing small temporary installations, they're not used to working with each other. There may be language barriers, there may be limited supervision. It's potential for accidents there. So the Labor Inspection Department of the Ministry of Labor is focusing on these priority issues during the World Cup. And on the issue of overtime, reinforcing this message that yes, this is an unprecedented event. Yes, there'll be more pressures to work on overtime, but really there is a need to ensure that overtime is voluntary, that it's paid according to the labor law, and that it's limited. And very importantly, that it's safe. How do you ensure that, especially for certain types of occupations, additional measures are taken to protect workers?
Thank you very much, Max, for that. And last but certainly not least, Faisal, maybe you could talk about how durable you think these reforms are post-World Cup. And of course, if you wish, talk about what issues you think remain in terms of tracking outcomes.
What issues, sorry?
What issues remain in terms of tracking the outcomes and the implementation of the reforms that have already occurred?
Look, before every international law, before anything, reforms, we are Muslims. This is our duty, all right, to treat people right. Okay, this is built in our ethics. We are not a pure capitalism of, squeezing people and, get the benefit out of it. Okay, I want also to mention the good side of workers working here. We transfer $62 billion from Qatar every year, transfer from expat from Qatar to Asia, okay, for the immigrants. So that's part of it. Regarding fast forward, of course, Qatar and the progress. As I said, we are an emerging country, okay? Talking about the detail of harassment, gender, whatever, today it's by international measurement. It's one of the safest place, in terms of safety, in terms of women walking outside at night. I think it's more safe than a lot of places in the West. Answering your question, will be another reform. Of course, after the World Cup, this is our legacy, actually. You know, those reforms are part of our legacy, we have said. But and after that, of course, we're going to benefit of our legacy. How will we benefit? Tomorrow, workers will say, well, you know, Qatar has a better workforce law than other countries. Why don't we go to Qatar? Regarding really the whole atmosphere of the worker, really after COVID, everybody waiting for this 28 days to recover. You know, today, if business goes well, there will be a firing. People will lose job. So this is really an opportunity. And to tell you the truth, just studying the ticketing and the people, you know, you have 950,000 people from Qatar already bought the ticket. So you really to anticipate how many people coming from outside, it's not, you know, because of global economic situation, people are not really spending more on extra, you know. We have 3 million tickets has been sold. What I'm saying that the pressure is not as expected, and unfortunately. Why is that? Probably, you know, as you can see everywhere, the economical the pressure on everyone. So the spending on the World Cup and traveling will not be as it is normally. Talking about reforms, yes, I really confirm, Max, this one. And I want also to acknowledge what Vani said, the punishment of companies that mistreat. They should not get away from it. The government should ban them from any future contract. I mean, this is very important, because if somebody have misled, because I really think in the beginning of all this, you know, I come from an open market mentality, whatever. We are not a socialist company, because as I see the whole, always the conversation about one side of the sector. I really also agree with Vani on that we have to involve all the stakeholders, because on the other side, I'm at the public, you have a lot of also from the business sector saying that some of the law we are surprised. Some of the laws we don't have time even to implement, you know. So it is both sides. It is to engage everybody, which is part of this and the reforms. So I will conclude that, you know, future-wise, heading to after the World Cup, yes, this legacy will stop. Reforms will be updated as needed. But I really want also to, and I know that, you know, our Amir, he is one of the first, His Highness, and the General Secretary who said, my citizen and the expat of Qatar. And the podium of the General Secretary, that no leader have said that. This shows you the commitment from up there to down. I mean, that's what I have to say about after the World Cup.
Thank you very much, Faisal. I mean, I just wanted to ask you maybe, and get in some of the Q&As we've got already.
Sure.
And some of these relate to different things we've talked about, but some are about the media. I mean, I know this was kind of touched on a little bit, but we've talked a bit about the reforms that have taken place, in addition to reforms that still need to be implemented and monitored. But do you think the reforms that have occurred have been reported on fairly? We'll start with you, Faisal, and then Vani or Max, if you wish to answer that question, please put your hand up.
Okay. Well, I don't think it has been reported fairly, to tell you the truth. You know, Max just talked about the security fund that the government have put for companies that not have paid in wages. Tell me where in the world you have a security, social security, or a fund that if the company does not pay, they will pay their wages until they settle in court. I lived in the US. I lived in the West in many countries, unless, you know, very social laws. I have not seen laws like this. So why this has not been reported fairly? Even one thing on, you know, mentioned earlier, the subcontractor. I know a lot of subcontractor influence from Qatar. They're being put in jail for late of payment of wages. Okay, this was not reported. Again, I know that a lot of people, Qatari influence, has been banned from travel and been punished for and banned from doing business. So I think the media have not really fairly covers both sides on the reforms and even on the punishment side.
Thank you very much, Faisal. Max, you want to pitch in with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the aspects of the coverage, which I think is perhaps underappreciated in parts of the media, is how significant these changes are. When we talk about the kafala reforms, these are a major deal when it comes to dynamics between workers and employers, dynamics that have been in place for decades. And when you try and uproot these practices, these entrenched practices, it's not something that can be done overnight. As Vani was alluding to, it's not something that you can just say, okay, now we're doing things this way. It's going to take time. It's going to, there are lessons that are going to be learned along the way in terms of application, implementation, enforcement of the law. And I think perhaps there's been limited understanding of how significant these changes are. Also, when we talk about social dialogue, elected migrant worker representatives, it's the first time this is happening in the region. There's a reason for that, but there's been a bold position taken in Qatar to allow it. At first on a small basis, on a pilot basis, through voluntary joint worker management committees, but now looking at really expanding it, looking at the possibility of making these joint committees mandatory for companies of a certain size. So these are really substantial, and perhaps these are underplayed. Then also when we look at issues like heat stress, the issue of heat stress, obviously an issue in Qatar, obviously an issue in the region, obviously an issue growing issue around the world. Qatar is often singled out when obviously it's applies to many other countries. The legislation in Qatar is, I think, the most progressive in the world. Certainly when we look at the number of prohibited hours over the summer in Qatar, it's more than double that of several of the neighboring countries. When we look at the additional protections that have been put in place, we've seen how it can have a concrete result on the impact of workers. We've seen the decrease in the number of patients admitted to the Qatar Red Crescent clinics over time, a 77% drop this summer compared to a couple of summers ago. So I think sometimes there's the issue of heat stress is a priority, is a major safety and health issue in the country, but there should also be recognition that substantial research and legislation has been carried out in Qatar, which I think will definitely have lessons that can be applied elsewhere in the region and around the world.
Thank you, Max. I think, yeah, this notion of recognition is important. Some people have certainly said that the feeling that the lack of recognition is somehow sort of a disincentive to reform. I don't think government should operate by that, but I think it's an interesting point when we're talking about a small country who may feel that they are being targeted or singled out. Vani, perhaps I could ask you the next question. I know you've all talked about it to some degree. We've talked about reforms, legal or otherwise. It's one thing having laws, but enforcing those laws is a different thing. What do you see as the main challenge maybe to the enforcement of labor laws and reforms affecting migrant workers? Do you see a particular challenge to the enforcement? Because laws might exist, but it doesn't always mean they're enforced.
I think one is the workers' awareness itself of their rights and how to access them when they're being denied that. So there's a culture of fear in filing complaints, and quite rightly so, because the complaints process can be pretty long. You're taking on your employer on whom you're dependent for your accommodation and your food. You don't want to, that's very much the last step. You're waiting till you haven't been paid for 10 months before you actually go and file a complaint, because you're worried about losing your accommodation or your food, or worried about being deported. So there is this that exists. And I must say that sometimes origin country embassies feed that fear of filing complaints. There are some embassies that are fantastic that will help their citizens through it. And there are some who won't, particularly the ones that bring in a lot of domestic workers. So that is one aspect of that. The other, I feel, is, and we're seeing this around the world, the increasing participation of non-state actors in the rights process. And I touched upon it earlier. So in Qatar, under the kafala system, the power that a non-state actor, that an individual employer or business holds, is pretty huge. So you may have reforms, you may have laws that criminalizes or makes certain practices illegal, but at the same time, you'll have something like the absconding law, which will negate all the great work because the employer can just press a button, file an absconding or a false theft case. The worker does not have the resources to fight it. And they end up in the detention center and they're deported. There is a process within a detention center where you can actually come out for your hearing, which most workers are not aware of. So there's this knowledge gap, the power of the non-state actor. And then after that, you also have to look at the mechanisms. Yes, I recognize Marc saying that they've increased the number of disputes committee, but they're still too few. And one way of looking at it is we shouldn't be waiting for workers. The majority of the complaints that goes to the ministry is on non-payment for those in the private sector. For domestic workers, it's a different level. It's physical abuse, sexual abuse, and there are no mechanisms that take that into consideration. When domestic worker is in the emergency, they call the police, right? But then she doesn't have the support. There are no shelters in the country to take care of a domestic worker who's been abused. In the private sector with non-payment, you shouldn't be waiting for workers to file a complaint for not being paid. The wage protection system is supposed to pick on that immediately, and you're supposed to correct it before it becomes so huge. The company has become bankrupt and has no money, and hence you have to go to the court to access the workers' support fund, which is not a social fund, right? It's a payment. The government is stepping in and saying, until the business pays up, we will help the workers with their funds, and there's a cap. So it's not a social welfare fund. It's a support fund for wage theft. So we need to also look at it from that angle. So basically, there are many problems, but I would say these four are the main ones.
Thank you very much, Vani. I think we're slowly running out of time, but I think, Max, you want to add something, and then I'll end with a final question to Faisal, which touches on something that was mentioned at the beginning. Qatar is, in many ways, has a vibrant media scene. It's the home of Al Jazeera, but questions have been raised about the local media, or at least the capacity of local media. One of the questions we have, Faisal, is where in local media do expat communities have a voice? So before we get to that, Faisal, maybe Max, you could just talk to what Vani was saying, and then we'll end with Faisal reflecting on the local media. So Max, please.
Thank you. No, just to your question about enforcement. A couple of years ago, we did publish a comprehensive assessment of the labor inspection system and also on the wage protection system. We found that there are gaps and challenges when it comes to, one, capacity of inspectors. So we've been involved in a continuous training program for inspectors over the past few years on different topics. We're seeing the results of that now. Two, gaps in terms of strategic approaches, using data to target inspections and use the resources of the labor inspectorate in a more strategic manner. For example, what I just referred to in terms of the World Cup campaign, what are the priorities? Which kind of companies should be targeted? That will yield more results rather than just a scattergun or random approach. And thirdly, the powers of inspectors. We need to make sure that inspectors are taking action against employers rather than giving second chances, third chances, to really serve as a deterrent to future non-compliance by employers. To some of the issues that Vani raised, fully agree that there are some limitations in the wage protection system, but I do feel that it does serve as it does work against companies that are still functioning, still operational. Where it struggles is with companies that are insolvent or really struggling. The penalties that the wage protection system or the Ministry of Labor can introduce immediately don't have that same deterrent effect that they would have if a company is still fully operational. And then to the 2 points you raised, I know that these are recent changes but I think it's important to make it. One, there are shelters now that have been reopened recently for victims of abuse, exploitation, not just for victims of trafficking. And two, about the absconding law. It is now harder for employers to abuse the system. So before, yes, at the push of a button, you could file a worker as having absconded. Now there are additional questions that the employer has to submit, including, has the worker been paid? Is there an outstanding complaint? Is the worker in the accommodation? And also provide two witnesses to verify the information that's being shared. This is really important to make sure that, the absconding law isn't being flagrantly abused. That addresses one side of the problem. And we'll see in the coming months to look at the data on the number of absconding charges and what the outcomes of these changes, what it's resulted in. What we still need to work on next is for those workers who have lost their legal status, whose QIDs have been canceled, how can they recover their legal status in a faster, simplified manner?
Thanks so much, Max. That was nicely detailed and built on what Vani said really well. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end, so we can't really talk much more, even though I'd love to, but I would like to finish with Faisal reflecting on local media. Faisal, as editor-in-chief, where in local media do expat communities have a voice, or migrant workers have a voice, in your opinion?
Marc, one very important part for everyone. I know there was, from the beginning of this session, local media. There is no, it is the dark ages where you can hide information. Social media plays a big part in Qatar and everywhere in the world. In dark ages where you can censor information and change and manipulate. This is over for global media and small media. For international cases, local cases, this is over. For me, really, to tell you the truth, you find individuals who has 1 million followers, who can influence any policies or any whatever. So to tell you the truth, it is our local community is very, very active in social media, and our media and social media. So to tell you the truth, what we are talking about today, social media, I mean, a mention an AG Plus or Gulf Times or Gulf Time, whatever, will go viral. So today is where I say there is censorship or there is whatever, I think this dark age is all gone. Today, social media, Max, I'm sure Max has a team that can monitor what is happening, and you are seeing the scene. So really, Marc, the whole scene of media have changed,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a shame, actually. We could probably do a session just on social media.
It's true, yeah.
And this as well, but I appreciate that. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time. I just want to thank you so much, Max, Faisal, and Vani, for joining us today and having a great and rich discussion. It's been really a privilege to be part of this. And I just want to remind our audience that the Middle East Council for Global Affairs will be publishing an Around the Halls on the World Cup tomorrow. So keep an eye on our social media feed. And thank you for the audience for the questions. I tried to answer as many as possible, and I think participants actually answered a lot of them anyway during their interventions. So thanks again, guys. Have a nice day. And if you're going to the World Cup, please enjoy it.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc, for hosting.
Bye-bye.